The desert don't ask questions. It just watches you bleed. Tama's own people left him to die out there, skin cracked, blood black with rot, half buried in dust like a secret shame, all for sparing a child, all for hesitating when they wanted vengeance. They called it weakness. He called it a choice. And that should have been the end of him, until Clara Mae came along barefoot, defiant, with a voice soft as dusk and hands steadier than any rifle. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't care what he'd done. She just saw a man clinging to life and decided that was reason enough. They say kindness can be dangerous. Turns out, so can silence. Especially when bullets start flying. What would you have done? Would you turn your back like his tribe did? Or risk everything like Clara? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I'd ride through the desert just to read what y'all think. Nutzer, the sun, a molten coin in an achingly blue sky, beat down upon the ochre desolation of the Arizona territory. Here, the land itself was a testament to endurance, a stark canvas of cracked earth, wind-sculpted sandstone, and the tenacious green of creosote and prickly pear. The desert breathed a dry, ancient heat, its silence profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind as it sifted sand across baked playa or the distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling on thermal currents. It was a place that stripped away all illusion, demanding resilience, offering little comfort, yet possessing a brutal, breathtaking beauty. It watched. This desert, a timeless, impartial observer of the small, fleeting dramas of men. Upon this burning stage, a young Navajo warrior named Tama lay broken, not by the white man's bullet alone, though a slug from a cavalry carbine was lodged deep in his thigh, a fiery torment, but by the heavier weight of betrayal. His war party, once proud and fierce, had been ambushed, their raid on a sparsely defended way station turning into a bloody rout. In the chaos, a settler child, no more than 5 winters, with eyes wide as desert moons, had stumbled into his path, his warrior's instinct, honed by years of skirmish and survival, screamed for the swift, silent stroke that would eliminate a future enemy. But something in the child's defenseless terror, a raw humanity that mirrored a forgotten part of his own soul, had stayed his hand. He had simply pushed the boy away, towards the frantic cries of his mother. That single act of mercy, a flicker of compassion in the heart of battle, had been his undoing. His kin, those who had survived the disastrous fight, had seen, to them, it was not mercy but madness, a warrior's sacred duty unfulfilled, a contamination. In their eyes, he had brought shame, perhaps even invited spiritual retribution upon them, and so they had done what their harsh code dictated for one who faltered so grievously. They had taken his horse, his water skin, his bow. They had looked upon his bleeding, fevered form with eyes as hard and unforgiving as the desert stone. And then they had ridden away, leaving him to the sun, the scavengers, and the spirits of the angry land. Now, Tama drifted in a searing haze of pain and thirst. The sun clawed at his exposed skin, and the infected wound in his leg throbbed with a venomous life of its own. Each breath was an agony, drawing the superheated air into his parched lungs. His tongue was a swollen clot in his mouth. Water, the word was a mirage, a tormenting echo in the arid landscape of his mind. Betrayal, that word was a shard of obsidian, twisting in his heart. His people, the Dino, he was blood of their blood. Yet they had cast him out, left him to be unmade by the elements, his spirit to wander, dishonored. He closed his eyes against the glare, and images swam behind his lids, the stoic, condemning faces of his brothers. The small, pale face of the settler child, an image that brought not regret for his action, but a confusing ache. Was this, then, the price of that moment's hesitation, to be stripped of his name, his honor, his life? He was a warrior, or he had been. Now, what was he? A broken thing, awaiting the final, patient embrace of the sand. The desert wind whispered around him, a dry lament, or perhaps a welcome, miles away, in a small, weathered cabin nestled precariously at the foot of a sun-blasted mesa. Clara Mae Walker moved with the quiet economy of someone long accustomed to hardship. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this isolated homestead and the needs of her mother, whose once vibrant spirit was now flickering like a dying candle, consumed by a relentless, wasting sickness. Each day, Clara Mae ventured out, a woven basket on her arm, to glean what sustenance and solace the harsh land might offer. A few tough roots, perhaps, or the precious healing herbs that clung stubbornly to life in shaded arroyos. Today, her search for a particular fever-reducing plant had led her further than usual, into a shallow, rock-strewn canyon where the shadows clung longer. Her mother had been restless the night before, her skin burning. Clara Mae's heart ached with a familiar blend of love and helplessness. She knew the look of abandonment far too well. Years ago, her father, a man whose promises had been as shifting as the desert dunes, had walked away from them, unable or unwilling to face the slow decline of his wife, leaving Clara Mae to shoulder a burden no young woman should have to bear alone. The memory was a raw place within her, a constant reminder of how easily a life could be discarded, a duty forsaken. It was the unnatural stillness of a dark shape sprawled near a cluster of greasewood that caught her eye. Her first instinct was caution. This was wild country, and she, a lone woman, but something in the utter vulnerability of that form, the way it seemed already surrendered to the earth, tugged at a deeper chord. She moved closer, her worn boots making little sound on the sandy soil. A man, an Indian, Navajo, by the look of his features, though it was hard to tell beneath the grime and the pallor of near death. A warrior, judging by the remnants of his attire and the lean, hard lines of his body, now slack and defeated. His breath was a shallow, rattling whisper. A dark, ugly wound on his thigh seeped infection, the flesh around it swollen and angry. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Clara Mae. The stories were rife. Of raids, of killings, of the unbridgeable chasm of hatred between her people and his. He was the enemy. But as she looked at his cracked lips, at the way his hand clutched weakly at the scorching sand, another image superimposed itself. Her mother, abandoned in her sickness, herself fighting a lonely battle against despair. And this man, too, was abandoned, left to the unblinking cruelty of the sun. Her small canteen was nearly empty, the water precious, hoarded for her mother and herself. Her own throat was parched. To give it away was a risk, a folly perhaps. Yet, the memory of her father's retreating back, the echo of her mother's quiet weeping, coalesced into a single, fierce imperative. She knelt beside the fallen warrior, her shadow offering a momentary respite from the sun's relentless assault. "Water," she murmured, more to herself than to him, uncapping the canteen. Gently, she lifted his head. The rough, Matted hair coarse beneath her fingers, she let a few precious drops fall onto his lips, a flicker in his eyes, a barely perceptible movement of his throat as he tried to swallow. It was the faintest sign of life, but it was enough. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing testament to Clara Mae's indomitable will. Tama was a dead weight, his body burning with fever. She had no horse, only her own dwindling strength. She looped his arm over her shoulder, half dragging, half carrying him, her feet sinking into the hot sand, her muscles screaming in protest. The sun beat down, and the desert watched, its silence vast and indifferent to her struggle. She stumbled, fell, rose again, driven by a compassion that defied logic, that transcended the bitter legacies of race and conflict. Each step was a victory. Each yard gained a defiance of the death that clung so tenaciously to the man beside her. Finally, as dusk began to paint the western sky in bruised purples and soft rose, they reached the cabin. It was little more than a hovel, its timbers weathered gray by time and relentless sun. But it was shelter. With a final, desperate surge of effort, she maneuvered him through the narrow doorway and onto the rough-hewn cot that served as her own bed. He collapsed, unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Clara Mae stood over him, trembling with exhaustion, her clothes dark with sweat and stained with his blood. Outside, the desert night began to fall, bringing with it a deceptive coolness and the ancient chorus of coyotes. Inside the small, lamplit cabin, two souls, each broken and abandoned in their own way, lay suspended between life and death, their quiet, improbable journey of rebirth just beginning on the unforgiving edge of the frontier. The desert, for now, had yielded one of its own to the stubborn mercy of a lone woman's heart. The small, rough-hewn cabin became a crucible, a pocket of fragile life carved out of the desert's vast indifference. For days that blurred into a rhythm of anxious care and fitful unconsciousness, Clara Mae Walker fought for the life of the Navajo warrior. The air within the single room grew thick with the scent of her mother's drying herbs, sage and willow bark, crushed juniper and the earthy aroma of desert mallow. Mingled with the metallic tang of blood and the fevered heat radiating from Tama's still form, she moved with a quiet, desperate tenacity, her weariness a constant companion. The bullet wound in his thigh was a festering pit, the flesh around it swollen and angrily inflamed, with water made precious by the desert's parsimony. She cleansed it as best she could, her touch surprisingly gentle despite the grim task. She made poultices from crushed leaves her mother, Ruth, had taught her were sovereign for drawing out corruption, applying them with a prayer more felt than spoken. Each time Tama thrashed in delirium, his guttural cries echoing the hawk's lonely call. A fresh wave of fear washed over Clara. Yet she persisted, spooning thin broth between his cracked lips when he could swallow, wiping the sweat from his brow with a cool, damp cloth. Tama surfaced from the red fog of fever slowly, like a man climbing from a deep, dark well. His first coherent thoughts were of suspicion, a warrior's ingrained alertness. He was in an alien place, the air unfamiliar, the hands that tended him pale, the language a soft, incomprehensible murmur. He lay still, a coiled viper feigning weakness, his dark eyes narrowed, watching Clara as she moved about the small cabin, tending the fire, caring for the frail, silent woman who lay on a pallet in the far corner. Her mother, he would later learn. He saw no malice in Clara's movements, Only a profound exhaustion etched into the delicate lines around her eyes and mouth. He saw the calloused strength in her hands, the unwavering patience in her ministering. Silence became their first language. Tama, bound by his warrior's pride and the fresh, raw wound of his tribe's rejection, offered no words. Clara, sensing the wildness still potent within him, the deep well of his distrust, did not press. She simply continued her care, her presence a constant, quiet offering. She would leave a bowl of broth and a piece of dry bread by his cot, then retreat to her own tasks, her back to him. A subtle offering of trust in a world where trust was a rare and fragile commodity. Slowly, like a desert bloom unfurling after a rare rain, something shifted within Tama. He saw the meager rations, understood the sacrifice in every drop of water she had given him. In every morsel of food, he saw her devotion to her fading mother, a quiet echo of the loyalty he had once believed immutable among his own people. One morning, Clara found the empty bowl not just pushed aside, but placed neatly back on the small crate that served as a table. A small gesture, almost imperceptible, yet it resonated through the cabin's stillness like a struck chord. As his strength began to return, a trickle at first, then a slow, steady current, the silence between them began to acquire texture, meaning. He would watch her hands as she ground herbs or mended worn clothing. A strange fascination in observing these small, domestic rituals of a life so different from his own. She, in turn, would sometimes find his gaze upon her, unreadable, yet no longer entirely hostile. One evening, as the coyotes sang their mournful chorus to the rising moon, Clara sat by the hearth, her hands idle in her lap, her gaze lost in the flickering flames, the weight of her loneliness, her unending vigil over her mother, pressed down upon her without conscious thought. The words began to spill, soft and hesitant, like water seeping from parched earth. My mother. She wasn't always like this. Clara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She used to laugh. Her hands were always busy. A garden. Quilts. She paused, the silence stretching, before adding, my father. He left. When the sickness took hold too tight, just walked away. Said he couldn't watch her fade. The admission hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Tama lay on his cot, listening. He said nothing, but something in the rigid line of his shoulders softened. He understood abandonment. He understood the fading of a cherished life. Days later, it was Tama who broke the silence. He had been sitting propped against the cabin wall, watching the play of sun and shadow on the distant mesas. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, the English words heavily accented, carefully chosen. My people, they left me. He stared out at the vast emptiness, his eyes reflecting its desolation. I did not kill a child, a white child. He spoke the words flatly, a statement of fact, yet beneath them lay a universe of pain. The sting of betrayal, the confusion of a warrior's code clashing with an undeniable impulse of the human heart. It was dishonor. Clara turned from tending her small herb patch outside the door, her hands stained with earth. She looked at him, seeing not just the fierce Navajo warrior, but a man wrestling with a profound wound to his spirit. Sometimes, she said softly, her gaze meeting his, honor is found in unexpected places. Tama, not always where others tell us it should be. Ruth, Clara's mother, remained a pale, silent presence in their unfolding quietude. Her eyes, faded but still lucid, would follow Tama's slow movements around the cabin as he regained his ability to walk. To help with small chores, she offered no protest to his presence, no fear. Perhaps in her own twilight world, she sensed the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere, the easing of her daughter's profound solitude. Her silence was a form of acceptance, a tacit acknowledgement of this strange, wounded man as part of their small, fragile household. As Tama healed, the desert that had nearly claimed him began. Paradoxically, to bridge the distance between them, he started to venture out with Clara, his warrior's senses slowly reawakening. He showed her how to read the almost invisible tracks of a jackrabbit in the sand, the subtle shift in the wind that foretold a change in weather, the meaning behind the frantic alarm calls of a cactus wren. He taught her to listen to the earth, to understand its silent language, a knowledge that was as much a part of him as his own breath. In return, Clara shared her world. She showed him how she coaxed life from the unforgiving soil in her small, sheltered garden patch, the way she carefully planted and tended her precious herbs. He watched, his initial stoicism giving way to a quiet curiosity, as she showed him how to prepare a poultice, how to bind a sprain, the gentle art of nurturing growth. There was an unexpected resonance in these shared moments, a quiet exchange of cultures, of wisdom gleaned from vastly different lives, the seeds of affection, sown in those first acts of desperate compassion, were nurtured by these small, everyday intimacies. Clara, sitting by the fire in the evenings, would unbraid her long, dark hair, the firelight catching glints of auburn in its depths. Tama would watch, his expression unreadable, yet his gaze would linger. In turn, used his returning strength to repair the sagging porch roof, his movements economical and precise, a quiet act of contributing, of belonging. Often, they would simply sit together in the companionable silence of the evening, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant sigh of the desert wind. No words were needed. Their connection was forged in these shared silences, in the unspoken understanding that passed between two souls who had both known the sharp edge of abandonment and the solace of unexpected kindness. Their feelings for each other grew not with a sudden, fiery passion, but with the slow, deep persistence of water seeping into thirsty earth. Vital and life-sustaining, the harsh landscape around them, the realm of fire and dust, became the backdrop for a quiet, resilient rebirth, for both the wounded warrior and the solitary woman who had dared to offer him her last drop of water. The uneasy quiet that had cradled the desert cabin, a fragile sanctuary woven from shared silences and the slow mending of broken trust, was destined to be shattered. Like heat lightning flickering on a distant horizon, word began to travel, carried on the restless breath of the wind or the loose tongues of infrequent passers-by, eventually reaching the parched, judgmental heart of Dustwhisper Ridge. A solitary prospector, his eyes squinting against the sun's glare, might have seen a figure moving with the fluid grace of a native near Clara Mae Walker's isolated homestead, or perhaps a lost cattleman, his throat raw with thirst, had glimpsed two disparate shadows sharing the meager shade of the cabin's porch. However it started, the rumor, once sown, took tenacious root in the town's fertile ground of ingrained fear and hardened prejudice. Clara Mae Walker, the reclusive woman who kept to herself, the one whose mother was fading like the last light of day, was harboring a Navajo warrior. The first official tremor of this encroaching storm arrived on a sun-drenched afternoon, in the person of Sheriff Clay Dunn. He was a man sculpted by the relentless Arizona elements and the equally unyielding pressures of maintaining a precarious peace in a territory where the law often felt more like a hopeful whisper than a resounding command. He rode a sweat-stained buckskin, his badge a tarnished star on his dusty vest, his eyes holding a weary sort of wisdom that did little to conceal the core of pragmatic steel. He found Clara outside, her hands gently tending the small, defiant patch of herbs that clung to life near the cabin wall. "Afternoon, Miss Walker," he said, his voice even as he touched the brim of his hat. His gaze, however, slid pointedly towards the cabin, lingering on the closed door. "Just checking on folks. Heard your mother's still keeping poorly. A hard road for you. I reckon some days are harder than others, Sheriff," Clara replied, her voice deliberately calm, though her fingers stilled their work amongst the fragrant leaves of a creosote bush. She knew, with a cold certainty, this was no mere social call. Folks in town. "Miss Walker," Dunn went on, his tone still deceptively mild, yet with an undercurrent that made the fine hairs on Clara's arms prickle. "They tend to get agitated about a lone woman way out here, especially with the kind of talk that's been circulating." He paused, allowing the unspoken accusation to thicken the dry desert air. "There's been no real trouble with the Navajo for a good long spell, but old fears, they die harder than old men. Some folks, they don't look too kindly on situations they don't understand, situations that seem out of place." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I wouldn't want to see you caught in the middle of any unpleasantness. Miss Walker, are you quite sure everything's as it should be here? That you ain't in any sort of predicament?" "You can't speak on." He even made a subtle gesture as if to ask to look inside. Clara straightened, meeting his probing gaze without flinching, though her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I appreciate your civic concern, Sheriff Dunn, but my affairs are my own, and I can assure you, I am in no predicament that requires your intervention." Her quiet refusal to allow him entry was a small act of defiance, a drawing of a line in the sand. Dunn held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly, a flicker of something, respect, frustration, in his eyes. "As you say, Miss Walker, but this territory, it can be unforgiving." To everyone, he turned his horse, the buckskin kicking up small puffs of dust. "You know where my office is. Should you find yourself needing it." He rode away, leaving behind a silence that throbbed with unspoken threats. The sheriff's veiled warning was merely the first gust of wind before the full fury of the storm. A few nights later, under a moonless, star-pricked sky that offered no comfort, a deafening crack tore through the night's fragile stillness, the sound of a rifle shot far too close, followed by the sickening thud of a bullet embedding itself in the cabin's sturdy log wall. Inches from the small window, Tama, his warrior's reflexes honed by a lifetime of peril, was instantly on his feet, a silent shadow in the darkness, every muscle coiled. Clara, her breath catching in a terrified gasp, scrambled to extinguish the faint glow of the banked embers in the hearth. They crouched in the Stygian blackness, listening with an almost painful intensity, the silence amplifying every creak of the old cabin, every frantic beat of their own hearts. After an eternity, they heard the faint, receding drumming of a single horse's hooves, fading into the vast indifference of the desert night. When dawn finally painted the eastern sky with reluctant streaks of gray, They found a crudely fashioned arrow driven deep into the doorpost. Impaled upon its shaft was a grimy scrap of hide, upon which was scrawled in what looked like charcoal, "He don't belong here. Next time we don't miss the window." The anonymous, escalating threat solidified their unspoken pact into a conscious alliance of survival. Fear was a cold, nauseating serpent coiling in Clara's belly, but now it was intertwined with a burgeoning, fierce, protective anger. Tama, seeing the terror in her eyes, felt a bitter, familiar shame. He was a danger to her, a magnet for the hatred of her people. That night, his voice rough with a pain that went deeper than any physical wound, he told her he must leave. "This trouble, it is Meja, Clara Mae," he said, the English word still tasting foreign, but carrying the weight of his conviction. "I bring it to your door. I will go. Draw it away." Clara, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through the bullet hole, shook her head, her eyes blazing with a sudden, unexpected fire. "No, Tama," she stated, her voice trembling but iron firm. Her hand, as if of its own volition, reached for the old, muzzle-loading rifle her father had abandoned along with everything else. "This is my home. My mother is here, and you are here now. We face this together." The following week, driven by the dwindling supply of a particular soothing herb for Ruth's increasing discomfort, Tama ventured out at first light. Taking the rifle Clara had insisted he carry, he moved with the stealth of a desert fox, every sense alert. But they were waiting. 3 figures, their faces obscured by dirty neckerchiefs, materialized from the shadowed rocks like malevolent spirits. Rifles barked. Tama felt a searing pain tear through his left forearm as he dove for cover, the impact spinning him. He landed hard, grit scraping his face, but his training, the deeply ingrained instincts of a warrior fighting for his life, took over. He returned fire, not with the cold precision of a raider, but with the desperate aim of a man protecting more than just himself. One attacker cried out, clutching his leg. In the ensuing moments of chaos and acrid gun smoke, Tama, ignoring the throbbing agony in his arm, scrambled through the rocks and thorny brush, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind him. He burst back into the small clearing around the cabin, gasping for breath, his arm dripping blood onto the thirsty earth, nearly collapsing into Clara's waiting arms. That day, as Clara cleaned and tightly bound his fresh wound, her touch gentle, but her lips compressed into a thin, determined line, the last vestiges of the passive caregiver vanished. The desert had schooled her in resilience. The hatred of her own kind was now teaching her the brutal necessities of war. Together, they dragged a heavy, fallen cottonwood log to further barricade the door. Tama, despite the fiery pain in his arm, showed her how to rig simple but effective trip lines using scavenged bits of wire and old tin cans that would rattle a warning. They cleared thorny branches and piled them strategically beneath the windows. Crude but effective deterrence, she was learning, with a grim focus, the harsh curriculum of survival in a world that had become a hunting ground. The full force of the storm, long gathering its malevolent energy, finally broke on a blisteringly hot afternoon. A formidable knot of riders, at least 15 strong, crested the low rise overlooking the cabin, their figures dark and menacing against the searing sky. They were led by Scar Maddox, a local rancher whose leathery face was a roadmap of bitterness and whose eyes burned with a virulent, uncompromising hatred for all native peoples. a hatred he fanned with oft-told tales of past grievances and supposed atrocities. They rode not with the reluctant, official authority of Sheriff Dunn, but with the arrogant, self-righteous conviction of a lynch mob. Their approach was not quiet. It was a deliberate, intimidating display of force, hooves drumming, leather creaking, curses muttered loud enough to carry. Maddox, a bull-necked man with a cruel mouth, was about to bellow a demand when Clara stepped out onto the cabin's narrow porch. The old rifle was already at her shoulder, its long barrel glinting ominously. Her heart pounded like a war drum against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But her stance, her grip on the rifle, was rock steady. Before a single word could be uttered by the intruders, before Maddox could fully rein in his agitated horse, Clara squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, its deafening report ripping through the oppressive silence, the ball whistling harmlessly but with clear intent over the heads of the foremost riders. The posse jerked to an abrupt, startled halt, their horses rearing and snorting, confusion and a sudden, unwelcome caution momentarily replacing the aggressive certainty on their faces. "That's as far as you come. Scar Maddox." Clara's voice, amplified by adrenaline and a righteous fury she hadn't known she possessed, cut through the ensuing stunned silence like a honed blade. Maddox, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Walker, you gone plumb crazy. We know you got that damn Navajo murderer in there. We seen the blood he spilled. We come to take him. By God, he's a menace, a threat to every decent white soul in this territory. He's a man, Maddox," Clara shot back, her voice gaining strength. "A wounded man I took in, and he's under the protection of my roof. You and your pack of curs are not setting foot on my property, and you're not touching him. He ain't your burden to bear." Woman, one of Maddox's cohorts, a weaselly man with shifty eyes, jeered. "He's a savage. Ought to be strung up." Clara's gaze, as cold and hard as desert flint, swept over their hostile faces. "He's not my burden," she declared, her words ringing with a profound, unshakable conviction that seemed to stun them into momentary silence. "He is my choice," as if her words were a cue. Tama emerged from the shadowed doorway to stand beside her. He was unarmed, his wounded arm held protectively against his chest, but his presence was an undeniable force. His dark eyes, filled with a warrior's unyielding spirit, met Maddox's, a silent, powerful challenge that spoke volumes more than any shouted threat. "This woman speaks truth," Tama said, his English still accented but clear and resonant. "I have harmed no one who did not first seek to harm me. Your quarrel is with shadows of your own making." Maddox. The standoff stretched, each tick of the unseen clock ratcheting the tension higher. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Maddox's men shifted in their saddles, their initial bluster somewhat deflated by the sight of the determined woman with the rifle and the formidable, dignified warrior at her side. Some of them, Clara noted with a flicker of hope, looked distinctly uncomfortable, their gazes darting nervously between Maddox and the cabin. Maddox, incensed by their defiance, made to dismount. "To hell with this. We're taking him." But as he moved, another voice from within the posse, an older, more hesitant rancher, spoke up. "Hold on, Scar. Maybe the sheriff ought to handle this. This ain't looking right." Maddox whirled on him. "You turn in yellow, Peterson." It was into this maelstrom of hatred, fear, and wavering resolve. This precarious balance between brute force and desperate courage, that Ruth Walker chose to finally release her tenuous hold on life. Perhaps it was the distant echo of the rifle shot, or the charged, violent energy that had enveloped the cabin, or simply her time. Later that evening, long after Scar Maddox and his disgruntled, visibly divided posse had sullenly, resentfully retreated, vowing with empty bravado to return with the whole damn town, Clara sat in the profound, sorrowful stillness of the lamplit cabin, gently holding her mother's frail, cool hand. Ruth's passing had been peaceful, a quiet sigh, a gentle letting go, a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the brutal ugliness that had raged just outside their door. Tama kept a silent, unwavering vigil by the window, his presence a solid, comforting bulwark against the encroaching night and the lingering threat. Clara wept, quiet, weary tears for the mother she had loved and tended for so long. Yet, through the haze of her grief, a fierce, undeniable clarity began to emerge, the last slender thread connecting her to her old life, to the suffocating expectations and petty judgments of Dustwhisper Ridge, had now irrevocably snapped as she gazed at her mother's serene, pain-free face, and then at the quiet, steadfast warrior who had become an anchor in her storm-tossed world, a man for whom she had faced down armed thugs, a man who now grieved silently with her. Clara knew, with a certainty that resonated to the very core of her being, where her true family now resided. The gathering storm had broken, and its fury was far from spent, but within the fragile, bullet-scarred walls of this desert cabin, a new, resilient kinship had been forged, tempered in the crucible of shared fire and encroaching dust, and it was a bond that would not be easily broken. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The raw wound of Ruth's passing, a quiet ache in the heart of the small cabin, was not given long to settle. The air itself seemed to hum with a brittle, expectant tension. Scar Maddox and his men had retreated, but their parting glares and muttered curses had been a clear promise of return. There would be no quiet grieving, no gentle transition into a new, solitary life for Clara Mae Walker. Her life was now inextricably bound to the wounded warrior she had sheltered, and their fragile peace was a flickering candle in the path of a hurricane. They did not speak of running. Where would they go? The desert that stretched endlessly around them was Tama's near grave once, and Clara's only known world. To flee would be to surrender not just the cabin, but the very ground where they had begun to reclaim their souls. Instead, a grim, silent resolve settled over them. This small patch of earth, this weathered sanctuary, had become their line in the sand. Tama, his recently injured arm still stiff, but his movements imbued with a renewed, fierce purpose, began to transform the cabin and its immediate surroundings into a miniature fortress. His warrior's mind, long dormant or channeled into the quiet observation of the natural world, now reawakened with a chilling efficiency. He showed Clara how to brace the door not just with the iron bar, but with angled timbers that would resist a determined rush. He dug shallow pits, carefully concealed with brittle twigs and dust, near the most likely approaches, not deep enough to kill, but sufficient to break an ankle, to disrupt an attacker's charge, with scraps of metal and dried gourds filled with pebbles. He fashioned crude alarms on the paths leading to the cabin. He even prepared piles of damp brush and greasewood at strategic points, ready to be lit to create obscuring, acrid smoke if needed. He moved with a lithe intensity, his dark eyes constantly scanning, assessing, anticipating. He was no longer just a man recovering. He was a warrior preparing to defend his lodge, his woman, the unexpected gift of a second chance at life. Clara worked beside him, her hands, usually gentle with herbs and her mother's care, now blistered from digging, her face smudged with dirt, her expression a mask of weary determination. The onslaught, when it came, was with the brutal, arrogant force of a flash flood. Maddox, his ranks now swollen with more of Dustwhisper Ridge's restless, fearful, and easily led men, appeared on the rise not long after dawn, their dark silhouettes stark against the blood-orange sky. They did not bother with warnings this time. No pretense of parley. A ragged volley of shots erupted, bullets thudding into the log walls, splintering the doorframe, whining past the narrowly shuttered windows. Inside, Clara, Tama yelled, shoving her towards the ladder leading to the small sleeping loft. "Stay down. Your rifle is there." Clara scrambled up, her heart a wild bird in her chest, the old hunting rifle feeling heavy and unfamiliar despite her recent, desperate practice. From the narrow loft window, she could see the attackers spreading out, using rocks and sparse brush for cover, their faces contorted with a mob's ugly righteousness. Down below, Tama became a blur of strategic movement, a desert spirit weaving between the cabin's meager defenses. He returned fire sparingly, precisely, aiming not to kill, but to deter, to make them understand that this would be no easy slaughter. The crack of his rifle was sharp, authoritative, a cry of pain from the attackers. Then another, as one man clutched a shattered knee and a second reeled back, his cheek bleeding from a ricochet or a well-aimed piece of shrapnel from a bullet striking rock near him. 2 or 3 of the less committed men, seeing their comrades fall and realizing this was not the swift, bloodless victory Maddox had promised, began to edge away, then broke into a panicked retreat. Maddox, enraged, roared at his remaining men to charge. "He's just one Indian. She's just a woman. Get in there and drag 'em out." But as a group of them tried to rush the cabin, one stumbled into a concealed pit with a sickening crunch, his leg twisting unnaturally. Another triggered a rattling alarm, drawing a quick, disabling shot from Tama that sent his rifle flying. Clara, overcoming her terror, began to fire from the loft, her shots mostly wild but adding to the chaos, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mingling with the scent of fear and desperation. During a momentary lull, as Maddox's men regrouped, their initial confidence visibly shaken, Tama stepped briefly into the open, his stance proud, unyielding, his voice ringing out with a power that seemed to draw strength from the very earth beneath his feet. "Maddox," he called, his English clear and resonant. This land gave me life again when my own people left me for dead. This woman, she gave me back my soul when I thought it was lost forever. I will not abandon her, and I will not abandon this ground. You will have to kill me to take it." His words, raw and heartfelt, seemed to hang in the suddenly still air. And it was into this charged silence that a new sound emerged. Not the crack of rifles, but the murmur of approaching voices, the steady tread of multiple feet. From the direction of Dustwhisper Ridge, a small, determined group of townsfolk appeared. At their head was Mrs. Beth Cartwright, a woman whose years had etched wisdom and a quiet authority onto her strong's kindly face. A widow herself, she had known hardship and prejudice, and possessed a moral compass that few in town dared to openly challenge. Beside her walked a few other familiar figures. Old Man Hemlock, who rarely spoke but whose eyes missed nothing. The young blacksmith, Tom Riley, his powerful arms now carrying a hunting shotgun. Even a couple of the women who had once whispered about Clara now walked with a grim set to their jaws. They were not an army, but their presence was a profound statement. Scar Maddox, Beth Cartwright's voice, though not loud, cut through the tension with the clarity of a church bell. "What in God's name do you think you're doing here? Terrorizing a grieving woman, trying to murder a man who, by all accounts, has done nothing but try to live in peace since she took him in." Maddox, momentarily stunned by this unexpected intervention, whirled to face them. "Stay out of this. Beth, this ain't your affair. He's a Navajo, a killer." "I see a man defending his home," Beth retorted, her gaze unwavering. "And I see a woman showing more courage than your whole pack of bullies put together. Some of us in Dustwhisper Ridge still believe in fairness. Maddox, some of us are tired of loud-mouthed cowards like you deciding who gets to live or die." A few more townsfolk, drawn by the earlier sounds of gunfire and now emboldened by Beth's stand, began to drift in, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval of Maddox's actions. The dynamic was shifting, the moral high ground visibly eroding beneath Maddox's feet. Then, another figure rode into the tense arena. Sheriff Clay Dunn, his face a grim mask, his hand resting purposefully on the butt of his Colt. He was no longer the hesitant, warning official. He rode directly between Maddox's remaining men and the cabin, his buckskin planting its feet as if to say, "No further." "Maddox," Dunn's voice was cold steel. "I warned you. This is over. You and your men will lower your weapons and disperse." "Now, Dunn, you can't," Maddox began, his voice sputtering with outrage. "I can, and I will." The sheriff cut him off, his gaze sweeping over the discomfited faces of Maddox's posse, then to the growing crowd of onlookers. "This town has been silent for too long, letting fear and hatred fester. Maybe it's time Dustwhisper Ridge learns the cost of its silence, the cost of letting men like you speak for it." He looked towards the cabin, a grudging respect in his eyes for Clara and Tama. "These people have a right to live in peace. You're violating that, right? You're violating the law." The authority in Dunn's voice, backed by the visible support of a significant portion of the community, was the final blow to Maddox's crumbling facade. His most ardent followers still glared, but the fight had gone out of them. One by one, then in small groups, they began to lower their rifles, their expressions sullen. Defeated, Maddox, his face purple with impotent rage, looked from the steadfast sheriff to the determined faces of his neighbors, then to the cabin where Clara and Tama stood, bloodied but unbowed. He knew he was beaten. With a final, venomous curse, he wrenched his horse around and galloped away, his remaining diehards trailing reluctantly behind him. A scattered, dishonored retreat. In the aftermath, a profound quiet settled over the land, broken only by the weary sighs of relief and the chirping of birds returning to the bullet-scarred trees. Widow Beth and Tom Riley were the first to approach the cabin. their expressions a mixture of concern and admiration. "Clara Mae," Beth said softly, her eyes gentle, Are you and your man all right?" Clara, leaning heavily against the doorframe, the rifle still clutched in her trembling hands, managed a weak nod. Tama stood beside her, his wounded arm held close, his gaze fixed on the townsfolk. Watchful, but no longer entirely hostile, he had heard Beth's words. He had seen their stand. It was not a grand celebration, no sudden erasure of deeply ingrained prejudice, but it was a beginning. The people of Dustwhisper Ridge, or at least a courageous portion of them, had not stood up for Tama because he was Navajo, or in spite of it. They had stood up because Clara Mae Walker, one of their own, however reclusive, had shown them what courage looked like. They had stood up because they had witnessed a profound injustice and, spurred by a few brave souls, had chosen not to remain silent. Tama, the abandoned warrior, and Clara, the solitary woman, had held their ground, and in doing so, had inadvertently held up a mirror to the soul of their small, flawed community as the sun began its slow descent, painting the desert sky in hues of forgiveness and hope. Clara and Tama stood together, watching the last of their unexpected allies depart. The cabin was scarred, their bodies were bruised, their hearts heavy with recent loss and the fresh memory of violence. But they were alive, and they were together, and for now, in the vast, silent expanse of the Arizona Territory. That was everything. The land had indeed given Tama life again, and the woman beside him had shown him it was a life worth defending. The acrid scent of gunpowder and fear lingered in the desert air for a day or two, a ghostly reminder of the violence that had breached their solitude. But like the tenacious desert plants that eventually reclaim even the harshest ground, life in the small cabin began, slowly, to reassert its quiet rhythms. The bullet holes in the log walls, once stark symbols of vulnerability, became tasks for shared hands. Tama, his wounded arm healing cleanly thanks to Clara's diligent care and his own resilient constitution, found a strange satisfaction in fitting new wood into the scars. His movements precise, his focus absolute. Clara, in turn, swept away the last of the splintered wood and shattered glass. Her actions not just a cleaning, but a quiet reclaiming of their sanctuary, the cabin, which had once been a mere shelter for Clara and her ailing mother, then a desperate hiding place for a wounded warrior, now began to transform into something more profound. A home. It was a home chosen, not inherited. A home defended, not merely occupied. A home built not just of logs and mud chinking, but of shared courage, unspoken understanding, and a love as steadfast and resilient as the ancient mesas that watched over them. They worked together in the small garden patch, coaxing life from the arid soil. Tama, whose people had long understood the delicate balance of give and take with the earth, showed Clara how to read the subtle signs of thirst in the leaves, how to build small, crescent-shaped berms to capture precious rainwater. Clara, in turn, shared her knowledge of the settlers' gardening ways, the herbs her grandmother had brought from a distant, greener land, now finding a new life under the Arizona sun. Their hands, one dark, one fair, often brushed as they worked side by side, a fleeting contact that sent a quiet warmth through them, a current of unspoken affection. The lines between their two worlds, once so starkly defined by prejudice and fear, began to soften, to blur within the peaceful confines of their shared existence. Tama would sometimes chant a soft Navajo blessing over the newly planted seeds, the ancient words a low thrum against the vast desert silence. Clara would read aloud in the evenings from a worn copy of Shakespeare her mother had cherished, Tama listening intently, the cadence of the unfamiliar words weaving a strange new magic in the firelight. They learned from each other, not through formal lessons, but through the easy osmosis of daily life, a gentle melding of spirits. There was one last, sputtering ember of the old hatred, a final, desperate attempt by a few of Maddox's most embittered followers. Weeks after the main confrontation, a handful of them, fueled by whiskey and resentment, rode out under the cloak of darkness, ropes coiled ominously on their saddles, muttering about taking matters into their own hands, about dragging that redskin out for proper justice. But Dustwhisper Ridge was no longer the same town. Word of their intent, perhaps overheard in a drunken boast at the saloon, reached Sheriff Dunn. This time, he didn't wait. He, along with Widow Beth, Tom Riley, and a dozen other townsfolk, men and women who had found their courage, met the pathetic posse at the edge of town. Before they could even get close to Clara's cabin, there was no grand battle, no exchange of gunfire, just the quiet, unyielding presence of a community that had decided, finally, to stand against the poison in its midst. "Go home, gentlemen," Sheriff Dunn said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of the law and the town's newfound resolve. "Your brand of justice ain't welcome here anymore. Not now. Not ever." The group, faced with the united, disapproving gaze of their neighbors, their drunken bravado evaporating like morning dew, simply dissolved, slinking back into the shadows from whence they came, their ropes unused, their malice impotent. That incident, quickly snuffed out, was the true death knell of Maddox's reign of fear. One quiet afternoon, as Tama and Clara worked together, repairing a section of fence damaged in the earlier conflict, Tama paused. He stooped. Picking up a handful of the reddish-brown earth, he let it sift slowly through his fingers, watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight. "This land," he began, his voice low, contemplative. "When my people left me, I thought the spirits of this place would claim me, that I would become dust, forgotten." He looked at Clara, his dark eyes holding a depth of emotion that needed no words. "But this land, through you, Clara Mae, it gave me life again." He let the last of the earth fall from his hand. "This is where I was reborn. This is home." Clara's heart swelled. She reached out, her hand covering his, her fingers lacing through his. "Our home. Tama," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The one we chose, the one we fought for." The simple words were a vow, a reaffirmation of everything they had endured and everything they had become to each other. They didn't speak of love in grand, sweeping declarations. Their love was not in the words, but in the living of it. It was in the way Tama's eyes would follow Clara as she moved about the cabin, a quiet tenderness in his gaze. It was in the gentle way Clara would dress the lingering soreness in his arm, her touch a soothing balm not just to his flesh, but to his spirit. It was in the shared meals, simple but nourishing, eaten in companionable silence or punctuated by quiet observations about the day. It was in the way they moved around each other in the small space of the cabin, an unspoken choreography of two lives seamlessly intertwined. It was in the long evenings spent before the hearth, the firelight painting dancing shadows on the walls, their comfortable silence a language richer than any spoken word. Each sunrise shared, each moon that waxed and waned above their small, resilient dwelling was another verse in the quiet love song of their intertwined lives. The seasons turned, painting the desert in their ever-changing hues. The harshness of summer mellowed into the soft golds of autumn, and the crisp, clear nights brought a sky so dense with stars it felt as if one could reach out and touch the heavens. Winter arrived with a surprising gentleness that year, a light dusting of snow that briefly transformed the landscape into a wonderland, followed by the vibrant, hopeful resurgence of spring, with its riot of wildflowers carpeting the desert floor. Through it all, Clara and Tama built their life. The scars on the cabin walls faded under new layers of chinking and the patient artistry of time. The garden flourished, a testament to their shared care. The bitterness of the past, though not forgotten, lost its sharp edges, softened by the steady rhythm of their days, by the quiet strength of their bond. One late afternoon, as autumn once again began to brush the land with its fiery palette, a different kind of storm gathered on the horizon. Dark, bruised clouds piled high in the western sky, carrying the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The wind picked up, whipping Clara's hair about her face as she and Tama stood on their small porch, watching its approach. Years ago, such a storm would have found Clara alone, bracing herself against the elements and her own solitude. It would have found Tama a hunted outcast, exposed to the fury of the sky. But now, as the first fat raindrops began to fall, Tama reached out and took Clara's hand. His grip strong, reassuring, she leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, a bulwark against any tempest. They did not speak. They simply stood together, two souls who had found an anchor in each other, ready to face the wind, the rain, the uncertainties of the future. For they had each other, and they had this small, hard-won piece of earth, this cabin that had weathered so much more than just the elements. They had a place they both, finally, unequivocally, called home, and in that shared certainty, there was a peace more profound than any they had ever known. What's your mundo? What did you think of their story? Was Clara brave, or just foolish? Was Tama a man reborn, or just another outlaw running from his past? I want to hear your take. Don't hold back. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them like letters from the trail. And if this kind of storytelling stirs something in your gut, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next tale of grit, grace, and gun smoke out on the frontier.